welcome back for another Share for Sodium video. Today I'm going to share a talk that I got to give recently to a group of osteopathic medical school deans. And believe it or not, they'd invited me to come and speak to them about the vulnerabilities of osteopathic medicine and osteopathic medical schools so that they could use that as a prelude to their own strategic planning. Now, this is a talk that was specifically intended for that very audience. And so some of the things that I talk about here, you may have heard me talk about them in other ways, and I may have provided more background or presented it in a slightly different manner because I really wanted to hit the right spot about being honest and thought-provoking and provocative without being offensive. And I'll be honest, I don't think that I hit that spot for all the members of the audience. I think some people were not very pleased with some of the things that I had to say. But I'm going to present the talk essentially the way that I gave it to the deans, because I think that some of the points will be useful and relevant to some of you who will choose to watch this. So here you go. It really is an honor to get to speak today about addressing osteopathic medicine's vulnerabilities, the view through an external lens. Now, some of you may have recognized the scene from the opening slide. It's one of the most famous scenes from the post-apocalyptic horror television series, The Walking Dead. It's kind of an old show now. It came out in 2010, but for the first couple of years, I was actually a pretty big fan of this show. If you haven't seen it, the show begins when the protagonist, this guy named Rick Grimes, he wakes up from a coma. He's in a hospital, but the place is abandoned, and it's very obvious that something very, very horrible has gone wrong. The world's been overrun by zombies. And, this is an alarming thing to wake up from. So in the first episode, in addition to avoiding being eaten by these zombies, Rick has got to figure out what in the world's going on. And in this scene from that pilot episode, he takes a horse down I-85 into Atlanta to search for his family. Only the city's deserted and the outbound lanes are filled with the vehicles of everybody who was trying to escape. It's an eerie scene. And part of what was so compelling about the show when I first started watching it was that there is this incredible mental exercise that Rick has to go through. Because he can see how the world is, and he knows how it used to be, but he doesn't know what happened in the in-between, how we got from here to there. And, when he thinks back about it, there were clues. There were some news reports about this new virus. It just didn't seem like a big deal at the time. And actually, I think this is the exact kind of exercise that you should engage in when you do strategic planning. And I don't mean you need to stockpile weapons and foodstuffs to prepare for a zombie apocalypse. I mean, you should imagine that you wake up in the future, maybe 10 years from now, and osteopathic medicine doesn't exist, or it exists only in a very different form than it does now. How would we have gotten from here to there? I mean, we live in a world right now where osteopathic medicine has never been stronger. The job prospects for osteopathic graduates have never been brighter. The options for specialty training have never been more diverse. I mean, there's still some anti-DO bias. I mean, that's true. But DOs have never been more respected than they are in the year 2021. So when you consider the history of osteopathic medicine in a long arc, I think it's very hard to argue there's ever been a better time in history to be a DO than there is today. But what if this is the peak? What if today is as good as it ever got? What if when you wake up in this post-apocalyptic version of the world, osteopathic medicine has now been re-marginalized or relegated to a different position in the house of medicine than the one that it now occupies? How would you think that we'd gotten there? What clues can we find in the current world that might have set up this apocalypse? So that's what I'm going to try to talk about today. But first, some disclosures and disclaimers. First, I have no financial interests relevant to this talk. I was offered a $1,000 honorarium for this presentation, and that money will be directed on my behalf to the Association of American Colleges of Osteopathic Medicine's Sherry Arnstein Minority Student Scholarship Fund. And I mention that because I want you to know that I don't have any ulterior motive here. I don't have some incentive to tell you anything about this other than what I really think about these issues. Second, I'll acknowledge that what I think about these issues is probably not what you think about these issues. My opinions are just that. And it's a delicate thing to talk about vulnerabilities. It's hard to be honest without seeming overly critical. And I'm going to say things that you're going to disagree with, and some of the issues that I've chosen to highlight are ones that I'm going to discuss in a way that's intentionally provocative, because I think they're real problems that threaten your profession, that you care deeply about. So I hope you'll take the observations and opinions in the spirit in which they're offered, which is honestly to strengthen osteopathic medicine in the long term. Third, I'm an outsider, and I want you to know that I appreciate that I'm speaking to a very learned group here. You spent decades steeped in osteopathic medicine and all that it takes to run an osteopathic medical school. I doubt I'm going to share any data that you haven't seen before, but what I hope that I will add is a bit of perspective, because sometimes things look a little different on the inside than they do to people on the outside. Last, I'm going to name names. At certain points in this talk, I will mention specific schools. My intent here is not to single someone out, and I actually thought about eliminating any reference to specific colleges of osteopathic medicine, but I decided against it because I think concrete examples are more meaningful than just standing here and making mealy-mouthed generalities. So let me be clear that the specifics I offer are examples of a particular point, and they're good examples precisely because the point that I'm getting at applies to many other colleges of osteopathic medicine, even if not to the extent of the examples that I highlight. So with no further ado, let's start thinking about vulnerabilities for osteopathic medicine and osteopathic medical schools. Vulnerability number 1, tuition. The data I'm showing you here come from the AAMC, and they show the average revenue for allopathic MD granting schools from fiscal year 2017. Now this is just an average. There's a lot of variability among the 139 MD schools included. Still, on average, the typical USMD school takes in around $933 million a year. The biggest portion of that is actually generated from patient care, from the faculty practice plan. That's the yellow slice of the pie you see here. That pulls in, on average, over $500 million a year. Other big revenue streams include research grants and governmental support, and then there's tuition. That's the little red piece, which brings in around $34 million a year. Now compare that to the average budget for an osteopathic medical school. So here are the corresponding data from AACOM for fiscal year 2017. It looks very different. The overall budget is now 15 times smaller, and now you'll see the majority of revenue is actually from tuition, even though the absolute amount, $34 million, is almost identical to the tuition revenue from MD schools. I know you all know this. Osteopathic medical schools are much more dependent on tuition revenue than allopathic schools that usually have a giant academic medical center attached, and those things generate massive amounts of clinical and research revenue. But I want to start with this graphic because it's a big vulnerability. In fact, in many ways, it's the superordinate vulnerability for all colleges of osteopathic medicine because it magnifies the impact of so many other changes that otherwise wouldn't be a big deal. Osteopathic medical schools will be uniquely sensitive and uniquely vulnerable to anything that decreases or cuts off tuition revenue. And so on the next couple of slides, I'm going to take you through a few particular examples. The first thing to consider is, will lenders always be willing to lend as much and as easily as they do now? I mean, after all, the vast majority of those tuition dollars come from student loans. And I really do think that we're in a transitional period here. I mean, we live in a very politically divided country, but one in which there's a surprising degree of bipartisan support about student loans. In a recent poll, 66% of American adults favored some type of student loan forgiveness. That's 2/3 of Americans. I mean, can you think of any other big political issue that hasn't really been acted upon that enjoys that much broad support? I really can't. At this point, Americans owe in the neighborhood of $1.7 trillion in student loans, which is an amount greater than the entire economy of Canada. I don't think there's any question that this is not sustainable and that there will at some point be student loan debt reform. I think the only questions are when that will occur and what it will look like. Now in this particular poll, around half of those who endorsed wanting student loan forgiveness said that they wanted a full wipeout of all student loan debt. I don't think that's a solution we're ever going to see implemented. But even if it were, it's not a long-term solution because even if you wipe out all existing debt, what's going to happen to the current students and the future students who continue to incur massive amounts of debt for going to school? The real issue is that tuition costs are out of control. When you adjust for the value of a dollar over time, the price of tuition has outpaced every other good in our economy. This is a graphic from the Wall Street Journal that makes that point. It shows just how dramatic the increase in tuition has been. Compared to 1978, the price of tuition in 2019 was up nearly 1,400%. That's actually twice the increase that what we see in healthcare, which is an industry that where we're constantly hearing that these increases are not sustainable. So I think that any realistic solution to the student loan crisis is going to have to involve some measures that at least indirectly work to lower tuition costs or to deter many students from going so far into debt. And this is how tuition looks like for osteopathic medicine specifically. These are the top 10 most expensive colleges of osteopathic medicine. You can see the tops of the group are topping out now at over $70,000 a year. And of course, the cost of attendance is even higher. The thing is that, the amount of tuition that a school can charge is really not bounded by access to student loans. Because since Lyndon Johnson signed the Higher Education Act in 1965, the U.S. government will cover 100% of loan defaults on federal student loans, and there's really very little oversight on the lending process. But what if that changed? I mean, what if lenders no longer had defaults guaranteed by the government? What if they began to have to imply some underwriting standards? I mean, it took me months of underwriting to get approved for the mortgage on my family's first home a few years ago, and the amount we borrowed was similar to what some students will graduate with in student loan debt. But, underwriting wouldn't have to be that stringent to put a damper on your ability to secure tuition revenue. I mean, these days you can't even get a cell phone without a credit check, but students can put themselves on the hook for over $400,000 of student loans without so much as anyone even looking at their credit score. Something's going to have to give. At some point, something's going to give. And look, universities have more lobbyists in Washington, D.C. than almost any other industry. And maybe those folks will be able to look out for the interests of higher education and maintain unfettered access to loans. But you know who's got more lobbyists than even universities do? Banks. And banks might actually be under some pressure very soon to make smarter loans to medical students. You see, there was a fascinating case that got resolved in bankruptcy court last year. The plaintiff was a graduate of Duke University and the Ponce School of Medicine in Puerto Rico. He was a first-generation college student, and he financed most of his education with student loans. But when he graduated from medical school in 2010, he didn't match. He tried again. He didn't match. Tried again and again. He still didn't match. So he worked as a dishwasher in a Mexican restaurant, and as a barista at Starbucks, and as a sales associate at Banana Republic. But the poor guy could hardly afford even the interest payments on his student loan debt, which by that point had grown from over $300,000 to up to $440,000. And so by 2018, he filed for bankruptcy. Now, normally, federal student loans are not dischargeable in bankruptcy. But in this case, the court found that he had given his best effort to maximize his earning potential and that he'd made good faith efforts to pay back his debt, and that there was no way he could repay his debt without undue hardship. And so all but $8,000 of his debt was discharged. Now, this is an extreme case. But if this does get established as a legal precedent, and student loans can be wiped out in bankruptcy, it seems pretty likely to me that lenders are going to have to think harder about the loans that they make to be sure that they'll get a return on investment from the degree that the borrower earns. I want you to keep that idea in your head when I start talking about match outcomes in the future. What I want to emphasize right now is, though, it wouldn't take a drastic change to lending policy to put osteopathic medical schools in a bind. I mean, remember, institutions in higher education have gotten used to being able to balance their budgets every year by increasing tuition at around an 8% rate. So suppose that because of some little change in loan policy or some other reason, suppose that you could only increase tuition by 2 to 3% a year. And at that same time, you began to have some increased expenses. That would be a recipe for disaster. For now, I hope I've convinced you of this much. Osteopathic medical schools are very dependent on tuition revenue, and that revenue stream is not as stable as it might appear. It's a vulnerability. But every vulnerability is also an opportunity, And I think it is incumbent upon leaders of osteopathic medical schools to work hard to diversify their revenue streams. There's no easy fix to this. There's no one-size-fits-all fix either. But it should be regarded as both urgent and imperative that every osteopathic medical school seeks to build partnerships with hospitals and governmental agencies so that if and when the flow of dollars through the student loan tap starts to slow down, your schools will be able to weather the drought. Similarly, I think osteopathic medical schools should make it a priority to build up their research enterprises. I appreciate that it's not realistic that faculty at most DO granting schools will suddenly go toe-to-toe competing for basic science NIH grant funding with applicants from well-established allopathic medical schools that have giant academic medical centers. But every college of osteopathic medicine should make it a priority to rigorously study and report on osteopathic medical techniques. Next year will be the 130th anniversary from the opening of Andrew Taylor Still's Medical School in Missouri. And the fact that so few osteopathic techniques have ever been subjected to randomized controlled trials or modern scientific inquiry is honestly a shame and an easily corrected missed opportunity. Now, there's another side of this financial issue that deserves to be fleshed out explicitly, because so far I've focused on schools funding and the vulnerability that arises if lenders become less willing to lend to students. But what if the borrowers become less willing to borrow? Because that's a vulnerability too. $275,000. That's the median DO educational debt for seniors who graduated in 2019-2020. $275,000. And again, that's the median, so half of your students are graduating with more. And this is only the debt that's incurred from their osteopathic medical education. It does not include any other debt that students might have, like undergraduate loans, student loans for master's or post-bac programs, credit card debt, anything else. We see this figure all the time, and I think that unfortunately we get sensitized to it. So I want to put this figure in some real terms. At the current 6.8% interest rate for student loans, you could pay off this amount of debt by paying $1,800 a month for 30 years. In other words, over the entirety of your career. You want to pay it off in 10 years, it'll cost you $3,200 a month. At 6.8% interest, you accrue about $1.86 worth of interest every day for every $10,000 loan balance that you carry. So your average student loan balance is increasing at around $2 an hour. In other words, when your average graduate goes in to work a 24-hour shift, when they come out, their loan balance is $50 higher. And look, this student debt problem is not limited to osteopathic medical schools. But what I want you to know is that it's disproportionately affecting your students. According to the AAMC, the average MD student who incurs debt graduates with a median debt of around $200,000. That's a big number, but that's still 28% lower than the $275,000 among DO students who incur debt. Plus, believe it or not, around 28% of MD students graduate with no debt at all. That $200,000 figure is only the median for students who incur some debt. So 1 in 4 MD students graduate with no debt. The corresponding figure for osteopathic medical schools is around 10%. You can see that osteopathic medical colleges are disproportionately represented on the list of top 10 schools whose graduates finish with the most debt. They make up 7 out of the top 10 schools, even though osteopathic medical schools only represent around 20% of medical schools in this country. So that means that any decrease in student willingness to incur this much debt is going to disproportionately impact osteopathic medical schools. Now you can say, a career in medicine is still a good investment. Physicians earn good salaries, and on and on and on. But you have to agree that this is not sustainable, and that adverse effects are going to occur well before you get to the break-even point where the debt that people incur is finally more than the value of a medical career. So how close do you want to get to that threshold? How much higher do you think this can go? I think we're probably closer to that limit than many people think we are. This is a graphic that appeared in the New England Journal back in 2013 from an article that was entitled, "Are We in a Medical Education Bubble Market?" A bubble market, of course, is created when people pay higher and higher prices for an asset because buyers are hopeful about its future value. But then the bubble bursts because some new sense of the real intrinsic value of that asset appears. So when students choose to buy an osteopathic medical education, they're doing so in no small part because they believe the future value of that asset, the future value of that education is going to be greater than what they're borrowing to pay for it. But in real terms, physician salaries have been increasing more slowly, while the debt of students has been increasing more rapidly. And so the ratio of debt to income has been becoming less favorable over time, and that's what's shown in this graphic here. You can see that the ratio of debt to income, especially for specialties like family medicine and psychiatry, it's a whole lot less favorable now than what it used to be. So think about that in real terms. I mean, you might have heard those figures I was tossing around a slide or two ago about the monthly debt service on a $275,000 student loan. And you might have thought, hey, $1,800, $3,200 a month, that's not that bad. Physicians are well compensated. But just remember that to make a payment of that much, you've got to earn an extra $30,000 to $50,000 a year pre-tax in order to make those monthly payments. So if you're a student considering going to osteopathic medical school, you could look at the physician salary that you might be making after 7 to 10 years of medical school and residency training, and you might see an alternative path in a different career that would get you to a salary that it might be $30,000 to $50,000 less over that same 7 to 10 year time frame. But you might correctly perceive that you'd be better off to choose that path, and you might choose to go that route. So are we in a bubble? Could that bubble burst? I really don't think that we're in an environment where physician salaries are going to continue to increase relative to the average worker. I really don't. And that means that for future generations to be enticed into doing medicine, growing debt is going to serve as an increasingly potent deterrent. So that's especially relevant for osteopathic schools because notice that this trend will not hit all specialties equally. The bubble will first burst for people interested in specialties with low earnings potential, which are disproportionately the fields into which osteopathic medical graduates enter. Here are real data from the 2021 NRMP match that show the absolute number of DO seniors who entered each specialty. So you can see that the overwhelming majority of DO seniors enter specialties that have relatively lower earnings potential, like family medicine or pediatrics. Overall, 54% of DO seniors match into one of the 3 primary care specialties, meaning IM, pediatrics, and family medicine. And that's a great thing. I mean, we need more primary care physicians. And compared to MD schools, only 37% of MD seniors enter those specialties. So it's not that that's intrinsically a bad thing, but it's a bad thing when you saddle your graduates with more debt to get a less well-paying career. And it leaves osteopathic more vulnerable to these financial pressures that I discussed. To summarize, the fact that osteopathic medical students incur more debt to get into careers that have less earning potential is an important vulnerability. But there's opportunity here too to advocate for policies that will help your graduates. First and foremost, you need to control tuition costs. There are no two ways about it. You also need to defend existing student loan repayment programs, and you need to advocate for more of them. If osteopathic medical schools are producing graduates that disproportionately serve in underserved areas, they ought to be rewarded for doing so. And the same politicians that have supported osteopathic medical schools being in their states, those politicians ought to be pushed to expand those programs. But this topic that I've discussed here about career choice, it leads to the next vulnerability, which I'm going to discuss explicitly. That's match outcomes. Match outcomes? What do you mean match outcomes? I mean, according to AACOM, match outcomes are great. Here's an announcement from earlier this year that shows a 98% placement rate between the match and the SOAP, and a 99% placement rate if you include the graduates who were placed in the post-SOAP scramble. The trouble is that these statistics are not exactly correct. When you look at the AACOM data that's used to make those calculations, some of their numbers differ from those that are reported by the NRMP. In particular, there are these 2 figures that I've highlighted in the red box. The NRMP notes that there were 100 more DO seniors that they recorded as having participated in the match that are not accounted for in the AACOM report. And similarly, the NRMP report records fewer DO seniors that were placed in the match or in the SOAP than the ACOM report includes. Now, before you say, but, what about the San Francisco match, the military match, this or that or the other thing? I'm talking about a comparison between AACOM data and the NRMP data. And the NRMP data about their own match are credible and authoritative. And there is no justifiable explanation for this discrepancy. The difference between the numbers, I believe, is simply that the AACOM data are self-reported by individual colleges of osteopathic medicine. And some schools are fudging their figures a little bit. They're reclassifying applicants who didn't match as if they never participated in the NRMP match at all, even though the NRMP records them as having done so. Or maybe they're classifying people who took a position somewhere doing something as having matched in the NRMP or SOAP, even though, again, the NRMP did not actually assign that match or position in the SOAP. This fudging of figures is in and of itself a vulnerability. And I think that AACOM and all of the individual colleges need to be very, very careful to report accurate statistics, especially when they differ from those that are reported by the official matching agency. And so, just so we have a shared vision of reality, I'm going to show you some data from the NRMP report. If you include all of the osteopathic seniors who were actively trying to get a residency position in the match, and that does include a small number of applicants who submitted no rank order list, presumably because they didn't get any interview offers, but they stayed in the match so they could participate in the SOAP, then the residency placement rate is 95.9%. That's not bad, but that's not quite as good as 99%. I think we can all agree. The pre-SOAP match rate is 88.5%, and again, that includes applicants who submitted no rank order list because I think it's fair to include those individuals. A little less than half of DO seniors matched to their first choice program, which is good. But there's one problem here, which is that only half of SOAP eligible DO seniors actually secured a position during the SOAP. And you should think about what happens to that group. Because if you don't get a position during the SOAP, the odds are not in your favor when you apply in future cycles. This graphic here shows the match rate by applicant type for matches from 2016 to 2021. And those upper lines show the match rate for couples, MD seniors, that's the blue, and DO seniors, which is red. And way down at the bottom, that dashed red line, that's the previous DO graduates who have the lowest match rate of any distinct group. Only 45% are successful in matching in subsequent cycles. So it's not a large number, but there is a non-insignificant and growing underclass of chronically unmatched DO applicants. This is not good for multiple reasons that include the failure to honor the school's mission and the failure to serve patients and the hardship for your students, but also the threat to student loan policy and the blemish on the reputation of osteopathic medical schools, especially when they're being considered by prospective students. And I want you to know about this too. Here I'm showing you the type of match by rank order list position for DO seniors from 2001 to 2021. Even though 42% of students still get their top choice in the match, that fraction has been eroding slowly over time. Meanwhile, the fraction of students who match at their fourth or lower choice has been increasing. Now, this is NRMP data, and so all of this, much of this predates the single accreditation system and the single match, and I would actually be disinclined to even think that this is showing a real phenomenon, except for one thing. This graph, if you look at it for MD seniors, it's virtually identical. It's virtually identical to this one. Overall, MD and DO, fewer students are getting what they want in the match. And you should recognize that even that represents a best case scenario because the NRMP statistics can only consider the outcome for what a student ranked. So if a student wanted to match at a different program but didn't get an interview, or they wanted to match in a different specialty but they got no interest from programs, if they ranked something else and they get it, their outcome may look like a win because they matched to their top choice program that they did rank. Here's another graphic about match outcomes that I'm not going to spend much time on because I know that you're generally familiar with the point. It shows the match rate by preferred specialty for MD applicants, those are the bars in blue, and DO applicants, those are the bars in red. And what you can see is that for every specialty, MD applicants enjoy a higher match rate than their DO colleagues. And the more competitive the specialty, the wider that disparity is. This is a problem. You can't sell a higher priced product that leads to fewer and lower paid career opportunities, not without some consequences. In the year 2021, I think that the majority of people, at least people with a functioning central nervous system, rightly regard DOs and MDs as being equal. But it's going to be very hard to make gains in the future, and you actually risk a serious erosion of the current prestige of the DO degree if you allow inferior match outcomes to calcify and become fixed. With the single accreditation system, I think that we're in a state of flux at the moment, and I think there's a real opportunity for osteopathic medicine here. Many residency programs for the first time are considering osteopathic medical applicants, and you want to make sure that you're giving them a resident product that will keep them coming back for more. Because unfortunately, one of the disadvantages of the distinctiveness of osteopathic medicine is that it makes your graduates readily identifiable. And that can be a good or a bad thing. Because unfortunately, I think to program directors, if you rank an applicant from a new MD school and they don't work out in your program, I think that on average, the typical program director takes the inference, well, I'm maybe not going to look at that school anymore. But if you take a new applicant from an osteopathic school and things don't pan out, I think more people will unfortunately take the inference of, well, I don't want any more osteopathic medical graduates. I think there's a real opportunity here for osteopathic medical schools to produce quality graduates that have been well evaluated and will step in and succeed. And there's an opportunity for the schools in particular to improve the way they evaluate students, to give better information to program directors, and change the way that they regard some of their applicants. Because obviously we're in a state of flux with residency selection in general too. Next year we'll have, for the first time ever, a pass-fail USMLE and a pass-fail COMLEX. And one of the primary metrics that programs have used to identify applicants that they want to interview and rank is going to be disappearing. But there's a lot of information that program directors want that they don't get. What I'm showing you here are data from the AAMC's program director survey in 2016. So they asked program directors to rank some characteristics of applicants that they might use in selection and to consider both the importance of those factors and how well assessed those factors are. So what I want you to hone in on this grid are the factors that are marked in green and red, because those are factors that program directors said are important but are not well evaluated. We live in a world where many medical schools have abdicated their responsibility to evaluate students. And let me tell you, MD schools have led the way in this regard. These days, most MD schools have pass-fail preclinical courses. Many have pass-fail clerkships as well. And there are some good things about that, and the reasons behind it are mostly well-intentioned, and I probably don't need to enumerate them here. But there's a problem when schools do that, which is that it leads naturally to discriminatory evaluation being outsourced to the USMLE and COMLEX. And you mark my words, whatever medical schools begin to meaningfully evaluate their students and provide useful information to program directors, you mark my words, the first medical schools to do that, they will do a service to their applicants because they will be rewarded by program directors. So can your schools find a way to creatively and meaningfully assess some of the competencies that program directors care about that are not well assessed right now? Sometimes when I talk about how medical schools need to do a better job of evaluation, people think I mean that we just need grades. We need more grades. And course grades are fine, but I think we can do even better than that. Here, for instance, is a medical school transcript from an MD school. I just pulled it off the internet. It's from a student from the University of Indiana from a few years ago. So it's, again, this is just for sake of example. I know the graphic here is small, but basically the transcript is showing you a grade like pass, high pass, honors. And it also, on the right, it gives you the distribution of grades for the class. So for instance, if I were evaluating an applicant for our pediatric residency program, I might see that this applicant had passed their pediatrics clerkship, which 40% of applicants or students at this school passed, 41% had a high pass, 19% had honors. So knowing that they got a pass and knowing that distribution of data, I mean, that tells me something about the applicant, I suppose. But is this really the best way to do it? Well, let me show you now one of my son's report cards. This is from his math class a few years ago. I think this is from fourth grade. It looks a little different than the medical school transcript. You can see it doesn't even tell me what his grade in math is. There's no math grade. Instead, there's a specific skill listed and then an assessment. And so the assessments, you can see, they have letters like S or D, and the S means secure, that he's secure in that skill. And the D means he's developing proficiency. So you can see at this time my son was secure in the skill of computing accurately and making reasonable estimations, but he was developing proficiency and the ability to continually evaluate the reasonableness of results. This also gives, down there at the bottom, you can see the math effort, which is rated on a scale of 3 to 5, and my son got a 3 out of 5, which I think was probably a fair assessment. But notice also there's no normative data for the rest of the class on this report card. I don't know whether other kids in the class are better at evaluating the reasonableness of their results more than he is or not. That's completely hidden to me on this information. But does that really matter? I mean, if my goal as his dad is to get him to do better in math, does it really help me to know how the rest of the class is performing? Instead, what I need to know to help him get better is to know where he's good and where he's got room for improvement, and this gives me a roadmap to do it. And I would argue that program directors have exactly the same task and they should approach it the same way. So I got to ask, why is it that a fourth grader's report card is more useful than the transcripts that most schools are giving residency programs? I really think that osteopathic medical schools could help their students by providing useful and authentic evaluation of their readiness for residency and of particular procedural or cognitive skills. And in the long run, those efforts will be rewarded by program directors. But I'm going to move on now to another strategic vulnerability, which is expansion. This is a graphic that shows data that will be well familiar to you. It shows the number of colleges of osteopathic medicine from 1922 to 2021. And in many ways, this is an incredible success story. There's strength in numbers. And actually beyond that, if you believe in osteopathic medicine, you should want to have as many DOs serving patients as possible. But I think it should also be clear that you expose obvious vulnerabilities if you expand too much. Just like a general in battle, you don't want to extend beyond your supply lines. What do I mean? Well, I mean, you got to think about where your applicants are going to come from. So let's take as a case study the state of Idaho. Idaho's not a big state, at least in terms of population. So if you look at the number of medical school applicants from that state, well, there ain't a whole lot of them. So these here are statistics from the AMC and AACOM on the number of applicants and matriculants who came from the state of Idaho. And remember that these figures for applicants are not mutually exclusive because many students probably applied to both MD and DO schools, and so they could be counted in both those figures. So realistically, there's somewhere between probably 200 and 350 medical school applicants from the whole state of Idaho. And of those, only 84 matriculated to an MD school, and only one actually entered an osteopathic medical school. So let's take a look at the state of medical education in the state of Idaho. Until recently, the only medical school in Idaho was the University of Washington's WWAMI Regional Medical Education Program, which takes 35 students a year. But because the population of Idaho is growing, they've recently tried to expand to 40. Of course, now we have the Idaho College of Osteopathic Medicine, and their business plan calls for expansion from 162 to 324 positions per class over the next few years. In other words, the number of medical students training in Idaho will increase more than tenfold from where it was just a few years ago. The same thing is true in Montana, which is an even smaller state than Idaho, but has been the battleground for an intense battle over medical school expansion. The whole population in Montana is just a little over 1 million people, and in the whole state, there are only 13 non-federal, short-term acute medical hospitals, and together they have a total of just 2,200 staffed beds. And Montana, unsurprisingly, produces even fewer medical school applicants than Idaho. So best case scenario, there's fewer than 190 medical school applicants from Montana in a given year. And in 2020, none of them actually matriculated to an osteopathic medical school. So what's happening with medical school expansion in Montana? Well, just like in Idaho, historically, the only option to train in Montana was the WWAMI, which takes just 20 students a year. But now there's going to be 2 new osteopathic medical schools in Idaho, which will again increase the total population of medical students more than tenfold. Now listen, I want to be very clear about something. There's nothing wrong with putting medical schools in rural areas or in small states. I grew up in a small town in central Appalachia, and there's potentially real benefits to having medical schools in rural areas. In a way, it doesn't matter where the students come from, it matters how many you can get to choose to stay there. But my goal here today is to help with strategic planning, and it is simply not good strategy to extend beyond what you can support and what you can support with the same quality that you've supported in the past. So there's really 2 issues here related to expansion. One is where your new students are going to come from and how qualified they'll be. And the other is where you're going to train them once you have them. Let's talk about the first issue first, the students. This is a slide that will make some people unhappy, but these are real data. It's a comparison of the profile, on average, of students who matriculate to MD and DO granting schools. As you can see, there are systematic differences. Students who matriculated to osteopathic medical colleges had, on average, less shiny objective measures of academic performance before medical school. And again, here I feel obligated to make a disclaimer because I am no MCAT apologist. You don't have to convince me that the best doctor probably doesn't have the best MCAT score. But I think you have to acknowledge that there is something here. On average, MD and DO schools are fishing in slightly different parts of the applicant pool. And if your expansion is too rapid, you may exacerbate this. Now, it's easy to say, a 0.2 difference in GPA, that doesn't matter. There's plenty of qualified applicants from other states that are being excluded from schools, and that may be true. But I think anyone has to acknowledge that at some point it does matter. Not every single person in the world is qualified and capable to become a doctor. I simply do not believe that to be the case. At some point, it does matter. The other thing is, even if you think I'm completely wrong and that osteopathic medical schools can continue to recruit just as qualified applicants with rapid expansion as they ever have, even if you believe that to be true, you still have a problem that you have to continue to train your applicants as well as you have in the past. And finding places to train doctors, it's not just about the shiny preclinical medical education building. You have to have clinical sites for students to train. Becoming a doctor is something you have to learn in part by being on the job. And finding places to do that has become an increasingly important battleground. Here's some figures from the AAMC's survey of their membership in 2019. So 84% of MD schools were concerned about the number of clinical training sites. 71% were concerned about the supply of quality preceptors. And both those figures, notice, are up significantly from 2011. The graphic shows the specialties about which MD schools were most concerned. OBGYN leads the pack at 51%, but pediatrics and family medicine were not far behind. And here's a statistic that's very telling. 67% of MD schools were concerned about competition from DO granting schools for clinical training sites. But competing for training sites is probably a losing proposition for everyone involved, insofar as creating a bidding war, it just increases costs that are ultimately going to get passed on to students. And that will be especially detrimental to osteopathic colleges and their students for the reasons that we discussed before. But understand also that MD and DO schools are by no means the only players in this arena. Caribbean medical schools are expanding rapidly as well, and they need places to train their students. And expanding even more rapidly than that are nurse practitioner and physician assistant schools. And that will continue to put a squeeze on medical schools in the year to come as well, because NP and PA schools have been very willing to pay for clinical training sites. And if you have a relationship between an academic institution and a hospital that's simply transactional, well, the highest bidder is going to get those spots. And I'll tell you, as an outsider, osteopathic medical schools already seem to be stretched pretty thin when it comes to clinical training sites. For example, Liberty University's College of Osteopathic Medicine, which is in my home state of Virginia, it sends students to hospitals well beyond its home base in Lynchburg. The farthest flung core site is in Palestine, Texas, which is 1,154 miles away. Meanwhile, the Burrell College of Osteopathic Medicine has students that go even farther, from Las Cruces to Rockledge, Florida, which is 1,805 miles away. And even that's not the farthest site I found with just some quick Googling. Some students from the Idaho College of Osteopathic Medicine rotate in Stony Brook, New York, which is over 2,500 miles away. And again, I've heard the defenses of this. I mean, it's good to be exposed to a variety of hospitals. We want the best training sites. We have schools in rural areas. I get that. But there's something here. You don't schedule students to go 2,500 miles if you had something 250 miles away. You just don't. Schools are getting stretched thin, and that's only going to be exacerbated by expansion. And distance isn't the only thing either. I mean, many colleges send their students to some pretty small hospitals. So again, and this is just for sake of example, Rocky Vista's Southern Utah campus assigns some students by lottery to hospitals in Utah and Wyoming that have just 39 to 42 staffed beds. You can argue that this is a good thing. You can say there's something to be learned at hospitals like these that you can't learn at big academic medical centers, and I grant you that. But I would counter it by noting that if your graduates want to do their residency training at big hospitals, at big academic medical centers, they're going to face a disadvantage if they haven't been given that experience as a student. So at this point, again, just like I said at the beginning of the talk, my point is not to single out particular schools. The issue that I'm highlighting here is widespread and generalizable. These are just convenient demonstrations of the point that I'm trying to make, which is that osteopathic medical schools look like they're stretched a little bit thin. Now, maybe you disagree. Maybe you make the counter arguments that I said before. But I think that if expansion continues at its current pace, you need to be prepared to make those counter arguments, and you need to make them vigorously, and you're going to need to make them potentially to a few different audiences, because you do not want DO schools to be perceived as offering inferior training. Back in the summer, there were many news articles about the expansion of osteopathic medical schools in the state of Montana, and in one of those articles, there was an interesting quote from one of the deans from the University of Washington's WWAMI program. And the quote essentially said that the LCME, the body that accredits USMD schools, would never accredit 2 new medical schools in a state with a population of 1 million and clinical resources that are already stretched thin by the existing medical school that's already there. Now, you can say, oh yeah, he's self-interested. Sure, that may be true. But I think the point there is credible and actually true. I do not believe the LCME would accredit all these new schools. That should give you pause. Because again, it's the perception here that in many ways matters the most. Osteopathic medicine, through its Commission on Osteopathic College Accreditation, COCA, gets to decide what schools get accredited, and no one outside of osteopathic medicine gets any say-so in that. But people outside of osteopathic medicine do get say-so in what happens to your graduates, whether they match, whether they get the opportunities that they want and they believe that they deserve. And if you're perceived as creating an inferior standard, that's going to hurt your graduates and it's going to hurt your colleges in the long run. I think that the Commission on Osteopathic College Accreditation can be an incredible asset to osteopathic medicine, but you cannot let it become a suicide pact. Currently, there are 10 new schools of osteopathic medicine, of which I'm aware, that are slated to apply for or receive accreditation in the years to come. And it may be that all 10 of those schools are highly deserving of accreditation and will contribute greatly to osteopathic medicine. But you should not feel that you need to apologize ever for maintaining a high standard. And you certainly do not want to be perceived as creating and adhering to a lower standard. And I'll tell you why. This summer, the Coalition for Physician Accountabilities Undergraduate Medical Education to Graduate Medical Education Review Committee issued some recommendations about what the transition from medical school to residency should look like. One of the recommendations was this one, which said that we need to jointly define and implement a common framework and set of outcomes to apply to learners across the UME to GME transition. This is not a binding recommendation, and even if it were, it's not clear exactly what the nuts and bolts of that would ever look like. But I think it's the kind of thing about which osteopathic medical schools and osteopathic leaders need to be wary. Because if that common framework about what students should learn and what medical education should look like and what competencies they need to acquire while they're getting their education, if that doesn't include the current model of osteopathic medical school, which involves students often scheduling many of their own rotations in far-flung locales, and at hospitals that may be small and where those competencies may be difficult to demonstrate, then it's going to present a real problem for osteopathic medical colleges. There's even a doomsday scenario that's probably not that far-fetched, in which colleges of osteopathic medicine come under overt attack from the AAMC. Right now the AAMC is leading the charge saying that we have this looming physician shortage and we need to train more doctors. But if you study the history of the perception of the physician workforce, estimates of whether we're going to have a surplus or a shortage vacillate widely over time. And you could imagine a situation in the future where we decide, whoa, we're going to have a physician oversupply. We're training too many doctors. We need to stop doing that. Well, at that point, the AAMC, to protect their own members, they might cite certain objective and hard to rebut data that DO training is inferior. They could show the differences between COCA and LCME accreditation, and they could highlight some of these training differences that I've noted. And they might point to overall poorer performance on ABMS exams or other data to support the fact that DO schools are offering training that's not as good as the ones that their members offer. And if they did feel pinched or threatened in that way, realize that those schools with their enormous budgets and their attached academic medical centers that employ thousands of political constituents for powerful politicians, they could leverage quite a bit of muscle to force colleges of osteopathic medicine to either increase their standards or get out of business. And with that, I'm going to come to my fifth and final vulnerability of osteopathic medicine, which is distinctiveness. It's funny to think about distinctiveness as being a vulnerability because it's the distinctiveness of osteopathic medicine that makes it osteopathic medicine, that makes it something that's worth fighting for and worth maintaining. And like I mentioned before, though, there are certain downsides to distinctiveness. One is that by being distinctive, you're distinguishable. And you can be distinguished for good or not so good reasons. So that's one side of this. But the other side, the side that I really wanted to flesh out more here, is that there are many things about osteopathic medicine that are distinctive. But as an outsider, it's hard for me to tell which of those are the necessary, essential pieces of osteopathic medicine. And in fact, throughout this talk, I've sort of assumed a certain context about the vulnerabilities of osteopathic medicine, but really, the vulnerabilities depend on what part you're trying to maintain. What is it about osteopathic medicine that you want to carry forward, that you want to protect? Is it the DO degree? Is that what makes an osteopath an osteopath? Is it the colleges of osteopathic medicine being distinct and having their own accreditation system? Is it the focus on delivering physicians to rural areas or treating patients as being a whole person? Is it your licensing exam? Is it osteopathic and manipulative medicine? I mean, all of these things are could be described as distinctive, but how many of them are things that are truly essential? And I think one reason that it's hard for me as an outsider to ascertain which of those is the most important thing is because I do not believe that it's been well articulated within the osteopathic medicine community about what are the essential parts of being an osteopathic physician. What are the parts that have to be defended, and what are the parts where expending effort and political capital and money to maintain something that's simply different, maybe that's working at cross purposes with what you're really trying to accomplish. Take, for instance, osteopathic manipulative medicine, which is certainly, I think, the most distinctive thing about osteopathic medicine. Studies show that very few DOs actually use that in their day-to-day practice. And I don't see any grand efforts underway to improve that. It seems like something that's sort of dying a slow death in once people leave medical school. And if that's something that you care about, that's a shame. Meanwhile, I see the osteopathic community circle the wagons to protect certain other parts of osteopathic distinctiveness that, in my opinion, are not essential. And the efforts to protect these things are really not what you want to be doing. And here I'll tip my hand. I think a cardinal example of that is the National Board of Osteopathic Medical Examiners and the Complex USA test. In a world where DOs and MDs are regarded as being equal, I think it makes little sense to maintain a separate but equal licensing examination, to insist upon a separate standard for your graduates. And yet, through COCA, the colleges of osteopathic medicine have collectively done the most to prop up the NBOME. And as you know, many of your students feel obligated to take a second licensing exam, to take the USMLE, just to be competitive in residency selection. As an outsider, I do not see the value add of insisting upon a different licensing examination test than any other physician, even those who train abroad, have to take. Instead, I see it as a vulnerability. Now, I frequently hear people say, but the USMLE could never stand in for the COMLEX. They're different tests. They test different things. Well, here before you is a plot of osteopathic medical students' scores on COMLEX USA Level 1 and USMLE Step 1. These data were collected by the NBOME. The plot that you see before you is not the plot of two variables that have no relationship to one another. In fact, knowing someone's COMLEX score tells you quite a lot about what they're going to likely score on the USMLE Step 1. Are there some content differences? Sure. On the margins, there are some questions on COMLEX USA that test concepts and principles that will not appear on the USMLE. But to me, that's a more logical argument in favor of the NBOME offering a specific examination in those principles and techniques, rather than mandating an entire duplicative and redundant three-part series. Remember, medical licensure exams exist to protect the public from unsafe physicians. They do not exist to fortify educational principles or philosophies. And so unless you believe that physicians who take the USMLE are unsafe to practice because they do not know osteopathic principles, it makes little sense to me why you would believe that those principles and their evaluation on COMLEX USA are necessary for licensure. And in fact, in most states, the licensing authorities agree with me. This is a map showing the examinations that are accepted for initial licensure of osteopathic physicians. All the blue states accept either USMLE or COMLEX USA as evidence of a capable physician that is deserving of licensure. So I have to ask, is COMLEX USA something that's really essential to osteopathic medicine's distinctiveness? Or is it just something that's different, and expending effort to maintain something that's just different without adding a whole lot of extra value, that may not be something that produces juice that's worth the squeeze? Instead, I think there's a real opportunity for the osteopathic medical community to collectively decide and then clearly articulate what are the essential parts of being an osteopathic physician. What are the key things that are truly distinctive and add value? They're not just different for difference sake. These are the hills that we're willing to die on. These are the things that are worth fighting for. And then maybe things that are just different, maybe you let those go by the wayside, because fighting to maintain them may work at cross purposes to the things that you truly care about. And that leads me into my final thoughts. When you look at the history of osteopathic medicine broadly, it's really an amazing success story. The movement for osteopathic medicine is one that could have been extinguished multiple times through its history for one reason or another, from the inside or from the outside. And it's interesting to think about why osteopathic medicine was successful. In part, it's because patients and the public want what osteopathic physicians provide. But it's also in part that throughout its history, at times when it was most vulnerable, osteopathic medicine made itself more like traditional allopathic physicians. They took techniques and medicines that the MDs were using and they used them effectively. They put more science in their schools. They emulated a medical education model that was done at the MD schools. And all of these things allowed osteopathic medicine to keep the things that were distinctive and important while also strengthening the profession as a whole. And for some of the vulnerabilities that I've highlighted through this talk, although I didn't say it overtly, there are some sometimes logical appearing solutions that might include working more closely with MD colleges or MD colleagues. And in some of my discussions with my osteopathic colleagues, I get almost a knee-jerk response when I even suggest those things. And I sometimes wonder why. A couple of years ago when I read Dr. Gevitz's book about the history of osteopathic medicine in America, there were many comments like this one. Osteopathic medicine occupies the same professional space as its older, larger, and more socially dominant counterpart, which wishes to absorb it. Now look, Dr. Gevitz knows more about this topic than anybody on this planet, but I'll be honest, that struck me as off. It's not something that I perceive, and I don't think that the osteopathic community should reject out of hand any solution or strategy that involves working more closely with MD colleges or MD colleagues. Now, I'm a basketball fan, and even if you're not a basketball fan, I'm sure you know that in this country we have one extremely successful professional basketball league, the NBA, the National Basketball Association. But if you're not a basketball fan, what you may not realize is that we used to have two professional basketball leagues. We had the ABA, the American Basketball Association. Um, Now, the NBA was the more socially dominant and established basketball league. It had all the blue blood professional teams, the Lakers, the Celtics, the Knicks. The ABA was the upstart. It had teams that were on shakier financial footing and they played in smaller markets, but they played exciting basketball. And so in the early 1970s, the NBA and the ABA began to talk about the possibility of a merger. For various business and legal reasons, it took about 5 years from the initial discussions to get to the point where the ABA teams joined the NBA. But that happened for the 1976 season, and this was the cover of Sports Illustrated at the time for the merger season. And you can see the NBA is represented there by the Celtics player Dave Cowens, and on the right is Dr. J, Julius Erving, who still is one of the best players in NBA history, and at that time was probably the most exciting basketball player in the whole world. Now, after this merger, the ABA was gone. There was no American Basketball Association. Those teams lived on, but they were now NBA teams. So in this merger, make no mistake, something was lost. The ABA name was lost. And that wasn't the only thing. They lost their basketball. I mean, the ABA, one of the things that made them distinctive was they played with these beautiful red, white, and blue basketballs. And those are gone. You turn on an NBA game today, they're going to be playing with a brown basketball. And even that's not all that was lost in the merger. Here's a player that we saw before. You might have recognized. That's Dr. J. And there he is dunking one of those gorgeous red, white, and blue basketballs. But I doubt that very many of you recognize his uniform. He's wearing the uniform of the Virginia Squires. That was an ABA team that played here in Virginia. They played their games in the Scope Arena in Norfolk, about a mile from where I'm giving this presentation right now. But the Squires didn't survive. They didn't make it to the ABA-NBA merger. They actually went bankrupt a year or two before. They were not on good financial footing. And so not all the ABA teams made it to the merger. Ask a fan of the Kentucky Colonels how they feel about it. Their team didn't make it into the NBA. Of course, for the teams that survived, it certainly worked out well. Ask a fan of the Indiana Pacers or the San Antonio Spurs or the Brooklyn Nets. All those teams are billion-dollar enterprises that feature some of the best players in the world. But yeah, we had the Virginia Squires, and we had the best basketball player in the world. And because the merger took a little too long, the Squires didn't survive. So there's maybe a side point here to make about how if you're thinking about a merger, you don't want to do it when you've lost your leverage. You don't want to wait too long. But that's not really the point that I'm trying to make. The point that I'm really trying to get you to consider is who won the NBA-ABA merger? And so far, I mean, it sounds like the NBA won this thing hands down. I mean, look, the ABA, they lost their ball. They lost their name. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. Because when you merge, you also get the opportunity to take the things that are important to you and put them in an environment where they can be important to other people as well. This is a famous picture of Michael Jordan from the 1988 slam dunk competition. The NBA didn't have no slam dunk competition. That was something that came from the ABA. In fact, dunking in general was an innovation that came from the ABA. In the NBA at the time, it was really considered sort of poor sportsmanship and brutish to do a slam dunk. Now, if you turn on an NBA game, I mean, dunking is an integral part of the game. I mean, it's what makes the NBA the NBA. And that's not even the only thing. Here's another famous picture. You can see Ray Allen is lofting a three-point shot there from the corner with 6 seconds left. This shot was against the San Antonio Spurs, a former ABA team, and it ended up tying the game and switching the course of the NBA Finals a few years ago. In 4 seconds, what was going to be a victory for the Spurs shifted to the Heat winning the championship. So why am I showing you this shot? Well, it's a three-point shot. And if you watched an NBA game in the early 1970s before the merger, they didn't have a three-point shot either. That came from the ABA. Again, it's impossible to imagine going to an NBA game in the year 2021 and not seeing dunking or not seeing three-point shots. Or if you do go to a game, these are going to be the things that get the fans out of their seats. These are integral parts of the game today. So I'll ask again. Who won the NBA-ABA merger? Was it the NBA or the ABA? And I think it depends what you think is distinctive and what you think you care about the most. And with that hanging in the air, at this point I'll stop. Thanks for listening to me today.